By now you've probably seen a lot of showcases of the special event we did showcasing the first expedition. During this expedition, and before it even began, I wanted to make sure that I gathered as much information as possible about the different changes and additions made to the game. And the first way I want to relay that is with my very own Ultimate Beginner's Weapon Guide. Now I say beginners because I wasn't able to fully test each and every single weapon and build, but based off the very brief time I had with them in previous experience, I wanted to give you an overall gist of how these weapons would work, and what I would recommend. Before we get started, I just want to point out that the game still has over 2 months to go before beta begins, and as we've already seen, the patches to this game have been very capable of drastically changing just about everything as we know it. So that means that some of this information has a high chance of being outdated in the future, but I'll do my best to update it as we go along. In total, there's about 11 different weapons available in New World, with surely a lot more to come. Each one of them contains 2 different skill trees, and in this video, we'll be doing an overview of all the passives and skills available for each one. Just as a brief disclaimer, these opinions are all my own and I will be making comparisons to my previous experience with the game. But make sure to use timestamps if you need to jump ahead, and let's go ahead and get started with my all-time favorite, the Sword and Shield. Now, Sword and Board is the only available combination in which you can equip a shield. Unfortunately, we do not have the ability to use a hatchet along with the shield, but weapon combinations like that have always been highly requested, along with dual wielding. Right now, Sword and Shield is the default tanking weapon for New World. It contains multiple damage reduction buffs alongside the capability for self-heals and taunts. One important thing to note though is that in a very recent patch, they introduced something known as Carnelian Gems. These can be socketed into your weapon to make various different skills capable of taunting a target. So not just the different skills on the sword would apply here, but I've seen Carnelian Gem compatible skills on weapons like the Rapier, the Hatchet, and surprisingly more. So what makes the Sword and Shield tick? Let's start with the passives. I'll go ahead and list them out before we go over the skills, and at the end we'll talk about my recommended combinations and the pros and cons for certain ones, along with other weapons that this one can combo pretty good with. So firstly, the sword scales off of strength and dexterity. Strength being the primary, with dexterity being the secondary. The 2 skill trees are named Swordmaster and Defender. The first skill tree, known as Swordmaster, focuses on DPS. The regular passives are Precision, Mobility, Opportunist, Confidence, Empowered Stab, Freeing Justice, Counterattack, Critical Precision, Achilles Heel, and Leadership for the Ultimate. Now these passives are separate from the ones listed underneath skills, and I did that on purpose because I want to do it in an organized way. So for the Swordmaster skill tree, we have the skill known as Reverse Stab, a stab attack that deals 175% weapon damage. First passive is known as Unstoppable Stab, and second one is known as Tactician. Second skill is called Whirling Blade, deals 145% weapon damage to all foes within 2 meters. First passive for this is Opportunity, and the second passive is known as Tactical Strike. And then for the last skill, we have Leaping Strike. You jump 4 meters and deal 125% weapon damage. First passive is known as Final Strike, and second is Cowardly Punishment. Now for the second skill tree, this tree specializes in self buffs, crowd control, and tanking in general. For the regular passives, we have Sturdy Shield, Elemental Resistance, One with the Shield, Final Blow, Sturdy Grip, Defensive Training, Fortitude, Recuperation, High Grip, and Defensive Formation for the Ultimate. On the skills side, we start with one of my personal favorites, Shield Bash. Deals 50% weapon damage and stuns foes in front of you for 2 seconds. You'll notice that this is also taunt gem compatible like we talked about earlier. But by default, the first passive is Intimidating Bash, with the second one being Concussive Bash. For the second skill in the tree, we have Shield Rush. First passive is known as Improved Rush, and second one known as Intimidating Rush. The skill itself allows you to rush forward 5 meters, knocking back foes and dealing 125% weapon damage. Last skill, which is also one of my favorites, is known as Final Stand. For 8 seconds, reduce all incoming damage by 30%, with the first passive called Final Countdown and the second is Restoration. This skill in particular is going to be the bread and butter of the longsword, and allow you to tank properly when it comes to just about any and all hostile encounters. For the basic attack, this is the light attack chain right here, consisting of a 3-part combo. And this is the Heavy Strike, which allows your character to thrust. As you can see, the animations have been changed compared to how they used to look, and it is still possible to cancel the light attack chain by incorporating heavy attacks between the second and third strike. For the pros and cons, the sword and shield tree is all around pretty good. It's primarily supposed to be used for tanking, so I would say it does the job pretty well. However, if I did have to think of any negatives, I am still sad that they changed the passives that were on the leaping strike. Because other than gap closing, I don't think this skill is as useful anymore, at least in PvE scenarios. For weapon combinations, I would most likely use this weapon alongside the Hatchet, because the heal passive on Final Stand will allow you to get a constant stream of healing coming in from both this and the Berserk skill in the Hatchet tree line. We'll talk about just how powerful the Hatchet has become in just a second, but I would absolutely rank this weapon as the #1 choice to combine with the sword and shield. Past that, I would most likely use the Warhammer or Greataxe. Warhammer because despite its changes, it still has a lot of crowd control capabilities that would be useful for warriors in most situations, mostly PvP. Greataxe might still be a better alternative for PvE due to its whirlwind ability and maelstrom that can keep mobs in one place. And lastly, for the skills and passives I would recommend, skill-wise I would take Final Stand just about always, followed by Shield Rush fully upgraded, and Shield Bash on the last one. If you have the Carnal Gem, you can make Final Stand do an AoE taunt every time you activate it, but because it has the default 45-second cooldown, Shield Bash might be a much more reliable taunt ability. For DPS situations, I would normally take other weapons, but if you do decide to DPS with the sword, I'd take Whirling Blade for the AoE and Rend debuff, then I'd take Reverse Stab fully upgraded for the DPS and cooldown reduction, and then I'd take Shield Rush for the Weaken debuff, the Gap Closer, and the Slow. Next up, time to talk about the Rapier. So the Rapier skills consist of 2 skill trees, Blood and Grace. The Rapier itself scales off Dexterity as a primary and surprisingly Intelligence as a secondary. And we'll talk about some interesting things you can do with Intelligence later in the video, but first let's dive into the rest. So with Blood, we have the following passives: Refreshing Strikes, Unerring, Heavy Puncture, On Guard, and Light's Edge. With the skills starting with Tondo. Slash quickly so that it extends the reach of your blade. The strike deals direct damage but also applies a bleed that will deal 100% weapon damage over 12 seconds. And this can stack up to 3 times refreshing previous applications. First passive is Thirst for Blood, second one is And Again, and third one is Proper Spacing. Second skill we have is Flourish and Finish. The Flourish part performs an attack that knocks back enemies. Pressing your left mouse button at the end of Flourish will continue this ability by automatically lunging forward to execute the finish. And doing this will consume all of the Rapier bleeds on any target, dealing 110% of their damage right away. First passive is With Flare, second passive is Swagger, third one is Fuel, and then we have the ultimate known as Bloody End. Lastly, the third skill is Flurry. Enter a posed stance and unleash a series of 5 quick thrust attacks, with each strike dealing more damage. Flurry can also be cancelled by dodging at any time. First passive is known as Overwhelm, second passive, Fleeting Strikes, then we have To the Bone for the third, and Finalize for the last. Now this tree specializes particularly in the offensive side of Rapier. This is where you have your maximum damage output and is a tree that really excels in PvE. You'll actually find with Rapier that it's got to be one of the most well-rounded weapons in the game right now. Every single skill in this tree is very useful in some way, so much so that you could mix and match in just about any order and still be completely viable. The next tree, known as Grace, has the following passives: Desperation, Red Curtains, Controlled Breathing, Perfectionist, and Swiftness, with Momentum as the ultimate. First skill is known as Riposte. We've seen this skill multiple times before, but essentially this one allows you to enter a defensive stance for 1 second. If struck during this ability, counter the attacker, stunning them briefly for 1.5 seconds. And when it executes, you become invulnerable for a brief time. This one is another Taunt Gem compatible skill for all of you literal madmen that think it would be okay to tank with the Rapier in the first place. But the first passive is Insult to Injury, second passive is Priority, and the third one is Lasting Consequence. The second skill, known as Evade, performs a small, reliable sidestep in your current movement direction that cancels any current activity and provides momentary invulnerability. Light attacks made during this evade are exceptionally fast. First passive is known as Breathe In, second passive is known as Allegro, Adagio for the third, and the fourth, Crescendo. Then the last one is known as Flesh. Lunge forward for 10 meters in a stabbing motion that pierces through enemies. First passive is Quick Lunge, second is Backside, and the third is Interruption. Overall, like I said, the Rapier is actually one of the only weapons where pretty much every single skill is good in most situations. This is the kind of weapon that I would usually combo with the bow being your primary and the rapier as a backup. For a second choice, I would happily take the spear weapon. Both of them have access to bleeds and the spear has more crowd control to back it up. But it is important to point out that you cannot execute the spear's bleeds with the rapier's flourish and finish. I wish you could, but at the moment, the only bleeds you can execute are the Tondo ones. For pros and cons, I can't really think of any cons, other than the flesh skill can kind of throw you off balance very easily if you don't use it from the right distance, and with the removal of stagger combat, outside of needing to use your dodges, the evade, and the riposte skill, anytime you're going toe to toe with an enemy, you have a high chance of taking a lot of hits. Which, since you're building dexterity mainly, and usually in medium or light armor, that might not be so good for your health. But that's more of a con of the combat system rather than the rapier itself. But the next weapon is the Hatchet. This one has certainly had its run of the mill ever since the preview when it was considered incredibly powerful. But after a multitude of nerfs and buffs to the weapon itself, the Hatchet has gone from hero to zero and now back to hero again. Except I think it might be winding up for yet another nerf, and now we're going to talk about why. Firstly, the Hatchet scales off both strength and dexterity. Strength being the primary, which means you'll get more damage with it by increasing that attribute, and dexterity as a secondary. It contains two different skill trees, Berserker and Throwing. The Berserking tree focuses more on the melee side, while also having without a doubt the most powerful skill in the entirety of both trees, Berserk. And the Throwing line focuses more on the ranged aspects of the game, allowing you to dish out damage from a range. Starting with the left side, for passives we have Enraged Strikes, Against All Odds, Frenzied Purge, Accumulated Power, Relentless Fury, Fortifying Strikes, and Desperate Refresh, with Defy Death being the ultimate. Skill-wise, we have Feral Rush on the first one, a sprinting melee attack that causes the player to jump forward, hitting twice. The first hit deals 100% weapon damage, and the second deals 115% damage. First passive is Dispatch, followed up by Crippling Strikes. Very second skill is the infamous Berserk. Triggers a Berserk mode that increases all attack damage by 20% while active. Berserk mode will be active for 15 seconds, and it's also Taunt Gem compatible, which does make a bit more sense when it comes to tanking. Now with the passives, On the Hunt, Berserking Refresh, Berserking Purge, and Uninterruptible Berserk, this skill has been remade into a powerhouse ability. Yeah, we don't get that 10+ second Tryndamere Don't Die button anymore, but a 30% heal, you remove all crowd control and have CC immunity, on top of this being a baseline 30-second cooldown that can be reduced with perks and gems. That's insane. It's also important to point out that Berserk can be cancelled early for that 30% heal to trigger right away. That's why I say comboing this weapon alongside Sword and Shield for tanking would be the #1 choice right now. And it's probably why either in the next patch or the one after is going to include a Hatchet nerf. Now the third skill is a new addition known as Raging Torment. I like this one. Perform 4 fast attacks dealing 80% damage with the passives Aggressive Approach and Final Blow. Of course, this tree will probably be the majority of what you spend your points on for the Hatchet. Because yeah, it can definitely be pretty cool to throw the Hatchet, but in comparison, there's just no contest. And if you're going to go ranged, you're probably better off using a bow, or even a musket for that matter. I feel like to accommodate the players asking for an axe and shield, they could totally straight up remove this throwing tree and replace it with a shield line, and I bet hardly anybody would mind. And speaking of throwing, for the passives we've got Aim Throw, Refreshing Throws, Boots and Rally, Rejuvenating Crits, Exploitation, and Adrenaline Rush, with Persistent Hindrance being the ultimate. With the skills, we have Rending Throw as the first one, Throw an Axe dealing 110% weapon damage and applying Rend, reducing the target's damage absorption by 10% for 4 seconds. Has 3 different passives by the names of Targeted Impact, Opportunistic, and Second Wind. Followed by Social Distancing, great name for a skill there, Throw an Axe forward and dodge backwards, dealing 120% weapon damage and slowing targets by 15% for 3 seconds. This one has 2 passives by the names of Quick Power and Stay Back. And finally, we've got Infected Throw. Throws an axe that deals 130% weapon damage and triggers Disease, plus weakens the target for 5 seconds. Disease reduces the target's healing efficiency by 30%, and Weaken reduces the target's damage by 10%. 2 passives here by the names of Mortal Power and Aerial Transmission. So the throwing side is more of a luxury. I don't think you'll need that many passives, let alone skills out of this one like we mentioned before. Probably the only one I would get is Rending Throw. That could be useful in multiple situations by applying Rend and reducing the target's damage, but overall I feel like this skill tree will be on the weaker side, so just make sure to keep that in mind. That being said, we have ourselves the basic attack combo. Looks like it's also been updated since last year. And then we have the heavy attacks. These can also be comboed into the basic attack chains to create even more attack animations too. For skills of course I'd take Berserk fully upgraded, the Defy Death ultimate passive, and then I'd take Raging Torrent and either Feral Rush for the gap closer, or probably Rending Throw. Would more than likely use the throw to pull mobs, so I would either use that or the aim throw that's at the top of the tree. For weapon combinations, hands down I would use this weapon with a longsword for reasons we talked about before. Then after that I would most likely use this weapon with the Greataxe. Not for any viable reason really, but because I feel like that would make me more into an actual berserker. Truth be told, you could pretty much combo this with any weapon, considering this could be your glorified oh shit button with the 4-second immortality and 30% boost on your health. Next, let's go ahead and move ourselves over to the two-handed melee weapons, starting up with the spear. This one was introduced last year during the Reekwater preview, and since then it hasn't had too many big changes to it, and I would say that it's a really good choice for PvP content, and can even be pretty decent in PvE. Consists of two skill trees by the names of Zoner and Impaler. Spear itself scales off dexterity and strength, with dex being the primary and strength being the secondary. For the first skill tree, we have the following passives: Deadly Consistency, Refreshing Reach, Invigorating Crits, Strong Conditioning, Evasive Maneuvers, Merciless Strength, Defensive Stance, and Reserve Strength for the ultimate. For the skills, we've got ourselves the Cyclone, spin attack that deals 100% weapon damage, pushes the target back 3 meters and applies a 50% slow for 3 seconds. Passives are Invigorating Combo for the first one, and Strong Momentum for the second. And then we've got Javelin for the next skill, which tosses your spear to do 125% weapon damage and staggering on hit. First passive is Forceful Impact, second passive is Refreshing Precision, and third is Deadly Distance. And the last skill, which is very good for PvP, is the Sweep. Sweep the target's legs, dealing 75% weapon damage and knocking them down, with the first passive being Tenacious Sweep and the second passive being Coup de Grace. This skill tree is pretty decent on the PvE side, but the only one that I would normally take would be the Sweep. That skill is good for both PvE and PvP, and as for the other choices, I think the next tree has the better alternatives. So for the Impaler tree, we have these passives: Precise Jabs, Crippling Jabs, Unerring Precision, Exacerbating Crits, Refreshing Jabs, Finishing Blows, Aggressive Maneuvers, and Exposed Wounds, with Exploited Weakness being the ultimate. First skill is Perforate, 3 quick piercing strikes that each deal 70% weapon damage and apply rend, reducing the target's damage absorption by 5% for 10 seconds. For the first passes, we have Rupturing Strikes, and the second is Impactful Strikes. Then the second skill is called Skewer. Rush forward and skewer your target, dealing 125% weapon damage and applying a bleed every second for 10 seconds total. First passive is Deadly Ambush, second passive is Follow Through, and third passive is Deep Wound. And for the final skill, we have Vault Kick. Use your spear to vault forward and kick your target, dealing 75% weapon damage, applies a stun for 1.5 seconds, and it is Taunt Gem compatible. Now the Impaler tree is where I think we want to put most of our points into. It's heavily focused on the DPS side, and if you combine the Vault Kick with the Sweep, that's a lot of good CC to have for just one weapon. And then if you add in Perforate or Skewer on top of that, personally if you're using this weapon with Rapier, I would probably go Perforate and rely on the Tondo bleeds for the Rapier. Especially because the Skewer used to have a follow-up attack, but that was removed, so now it does less initial damage. But yeah, I would probably combine this weapon with the Rapier, and I think it would also mesh well with both the bow and the musket, because if you're primarily using this weapon as a backup if the enemy gets close, you can whip it out and do a quick sweep or a vault kick, and then switch right back to ranged weapon to capitalize if you want to. And then we've got ourselves the Greataxe. One of my favorite additions, although I'm still waiting for the Greatsword to make a debut. But the Greataxe sounded really good on paper when we first saw it, and I'm super happy to have it in general, but in game, the Greataxe actually leaves a little bit to be desired, at least in its current state. The weapon itself scales primarily off of strength, has 2 skill trees by the names of Reaper and Mauler, and starting with the Reaper, we've got these passives: Critical Gains, Frustration, Keen Edge, Feed, Executioner Speed, Greed, Death's Embrace, and Critical Condition, with Bloodlust being the ultimate. First skill is going to be Charge, one that I actually enjoy using very much. Charge 10 meters, dealing 130% weapon damage when you reach a target or press left mouse button. This has an unstoppable buff, so you cannot be interrupted while using this ability. First passive, Frenzied Momentum. Second passive, Unpredictable Strike. For the second skill, we've got Reap. Extend your weapon 5 meters, pulling foes to you, dealing 107% weapon damage, and this one is also Taunt Gem compatible. First passive is the Collector, second passive, Hunger, And the third one, Fatal Attraction. Last skill is known as Execute, a powerful overhead attack dealing 175% weapon damage. First passive is Unstoppable Greed, and second, Executioner. This first tree, I would honestly not use anything but the charge, mainly because even though the Reap skill has the 30% heal of the damage done, it's such an unreliable skill that if you're slightly too far or slightly too close in range, the skill is just gonna miss. But also without the stagger, it kinda makes it a dangerous game to play to leave yourself open like that after pulling an enemy directly towards you. And Execute I wouldn't really use mainly because of the wind up. This seems like a very easy skill for people to dodge, and as far as it says, it doesn't really do any CC. It's kinda in the same boat as the Mighty Gavel is for the Warhammer, where they don't seem to match their animations effects wise, but that could also change in the future. Charge I like using though, because you can use a basic or heavy attack and then cancel into it. Now for the second tree, passive wise we've got ourselves Mauler's Resolve, Gravity, Center of Attention, Heavy Pull, Enduring Pull, Revenge, and Crowded Protection, with Mauler's Fury as the ultimate. Then for the skills, we've got Whirlwind, Spin Attack dealing 50% weapon damage to all nearby foes. If you manage to hit a foe, spin up to 4 times and you can also move while doing this. First passive is Gusting Winds, second passive Unending Winds, and third, Surrounded. Second skill we've got is Maelstrom. Love the name on this one by the way. Fast spinning attack that pulls targets closer to you and deals 115% weapon damage. First passive is Storm's Reach, second passive is Absorb, and third is No Reprieve. And finally, we've got the Gravity Well. Throw your axe to create a vortex that pulls foes to its center for 3 seconds. Ends with the damaging burst dealing 100% weapon damage, and the range on this is 10 meters. First passive we've got is Crowded Well, with the second being Unyielding. Overall, I would rate the Greataxe as being in one of the lesser states of the weapons, because right now it just doesn't seem to perform as well as its counterparts. It can be useful in PvE situations, especially with the Whirlwind and group farming, but past that and the charge skill, also maybe Maelstrom, the other ones leave a lot to be desired. The basic attack combo also does feel a little weird right now. I do like the heavy attack animations and it can synergize pretty well with these other skills, but I think there's some improvements to be had here, on both the DPS side and the sustain side. And with 6 weapons left to go over, let's go ahead and continue with the Warhammer. This weapon, in my opinion, has probably been in the doghouse the longest. I'd imagine that most of you didn't see or hear about how ridiculously powerful this weapon was when it first debuted, but it's been hit really hard with the nerfs ever since. Actually kind of ashamed to see, because before some of those other weapons came out, I loved using the Warhammer. Its crowd control could mesh really well with Sword and Shield or Hatchet, and I think that multiple times during its lifespan, it was in a decent enough spot to be left alone for the most part. Some tweaks might have been needed here and there for sure, but this previous tweak to the weapon I just didn't really like at all. I expand more on that in the balance video we did, but let's go ahead and talk about the passives and the skill trees. 2 trees total, Juggernaut and Crowd Crusher. The weapon scales primarily and only off of strength, and for the Jug side, passives start off with Epitome of Bonk, Exhaustive Attacks, Quick Recovery, Hammer Time, Hardened Steel, Contemption, and Power Through Pain, with Justice for All being the ultimate. The skills start off with Armor Breaker, a powerful swing that penetrates 35% of the target's armor and deals 120% weapon damage. I really miss the way this skill used to work, because Block Breaker was great in player versus environment. Passives on this one are Indomitable, Lasting Trauma, and Opening Act. Then we've got ourselves Mighty Gavel. Unfortunately, this one had an animation change recently that makes the skill a little bit more weird to use, but it's taken over the animation from Path of Destiny. This skill does an overhead leaping attack that crushes down on enemies dealing 120% weapon damage. First passive is Summary Judgment, second is Impact Fracture, and the third is Expedite, with of course Justice for All being the last one. And lastly, we've got Wrecking Ball. Strike the ground around a target with the hammer dealing 100% weapon damage and flattening the enemy. First passive on this one is Safety Measures, with the second being Breathing Room. Now before the recent changes, I would have gladly taken Mighty Gavel for most situations, but with the removal of the crowd control, I've completely shifted the usefulness of the Warhammer onto the right side tree. And speaking of the right side, passives start with Outnumbered, Facilitate, Expedition, Resurgence, I Can Do This All Day, Guarded Spirit, Acceleration, Concussive Impact, and Prevailing Spirit, with the ultimate being Aftershock. Skill-wise, we've got Shockwave, slam the hammer into the ground causing a 3-meter radius AoE earthquake that deals 90% weapon damage, and applies a stun to all impacted targets for 1.8 seconds. Also Taunt Gem compatible. Second one is Clear Out, a fun one to use in most situations for sure, a wide swing that knocks enemies back 4 meters to create distance and deals 110% weapon damage. Passives are Power Cleaner, Clean and Refreshed, and Swing Away, with the final skill being Path of Destiny, the one that's unfortunately been given the worst possible wind-up animation in the entire Warhammer skill line. A powerful ground strike that erupts a linear wave of energy in front of the player, dealing 125% weapon damage to all targets in its path. Passives are Seismic Waves and Stimulated Reduction. Despite my qualms with both the Greataxe and the Warhammer at the moment, the hammer still does have its usefulness as well, but both the damage and crowd control have taken a hit on this weapon, and it's a shadow of its former glory. Really hoping that can improve in the future, because I would love to see this one make a proper comeback, and get those animations switched back around if possible. And with all the melee weapons out of the way, let's talk about ranged. Kicking it off with the bow, of course, this is a weapon that's always been highly ranked on the power scale when it comes to the weapons, mainly due to how ridiculous the spread shot always was. With it fully upgraded, you had 5 shots going off in your face all at once. Sometimes that was not fun to say the least, unless you were the one behind the bow. But since then, it's been changed slightly into a skill known as Splinter Shot, and with the 10 meter requirement before it splits and other changes made, I think the weapon is now in a state that I think everybody would consider pretty balanced. But first, we've got the Skirmisher tree on the left and Hunter tree on the right. The weapon scales off dexterity, and starting with the passives, on the left we've got Impale, Dodge and Weave, Mark, Catch Me If You Can, Evasive Tactics, Closing In, Hunter's Insight, Archer's Speed, and Battle Precision, with Knee Shot for the ultimate. For the skills side, we've got Poison Shot to start with, previously known as Smoke Shot, shoots a poison arrow that on hit or land, creates a cloud of poison for 3 meters wide that lasts a total of 10 seconds. First passive, Infected Arrow, and second passive is Direct Hit. Next skill is Evade Shot. Jump back 5 meters and shoot an arrow dealing 125% weapon damage. Passives are Evasive Knockback and Go the Distance, with the last skill being Rain of Arrows. Shoot a barrage of arrows 7 meters wide, dealing 150% weapon damage. First passive is Barbed Arrows, with the second being Hooked Arrows. Overall, it's a pretty decent tree, you've got some utility there, but I think when it comes to what'll be the most viable, that'll majorly come from the second tree. And now, we've got the Hunter. Passives start with Long Range, Finishing Shot, Surprise Attack, Hawkeye, Aim True, Unbreakable Focus, Opening Strike, Arrow Range, and Bullseye, with Concussion being the ultimate. Skills side, we've got my favorites, starting with Rapid Shot, shoot 3 consecutive arrows, the first 2 dealing 100% weapon damage each, then the last one dealing 125% and causing a knockback. First passive, Rapid Accuracy, and second passive is Final Blow. Then we've got Penetrating Shot in the middle, shoot an arrow dealing 150% weapon damage that passes through targets and continues for 100 meters. This is a really good thing to combo right after a shot, by the way. Passives are Blood-Soaked Arrow and Deep Strike. Then lastly, we have Splinter Shot. Shoots an arrow 10 meters forward, and then it splits into 3 arrows, dealing 50% weapon damage per, and then it upgrades into Scatter Shot and then Calculated. So this tree is where you'll see the most, in my opinion, viable skills for the bow. I think Rain of Arrows can be pretty decent for AoE mob farming, and potentially Territory Wars for the 12-second slow. But aside from that, I would probably start trying to use Poison Shot for that area denial and damage over time. I'm not sure if I would take the Splinter Shot anymore, because that 10 meter requirement makes it a little bit more difficult to pull off, which truth be told does make sense because Spread Shot was doing a ridiculous amount of damage. And I would always take Penetrating Shot no matter what, alongside probably Rapid Fire unless I needed to use Rain of Arrows for anything. Penetrating is not only something you can combo after a basic or heavy arrow shot, but also has a noticeably bigger hitbox when you execute the skill. Most targets that I normally wouldn't be able to hit without being dead on the crosshairs, I would use Penetrating Shot to get the connect. Highly recommend this skill, and I would normally combo this weapon with the melee weapon to back it up, so in that case either Hatchet for the sustain and last resort, Rapier if you want some melee DPS to use when your bow skills are on cooldown, or especially Spear for that crowd control you can use when people get too close, and switch back to gain some distance. Could even do the same with Musket if you want to. You could throw down some traps and then switch back to bow and use Evade Shot to jump backwards. And speaking of Musket, let's continue with this weapon. So we've got 2 skill trees, Sharpshooter and Trapper. Musket scales primarily off of dexterity, but surprisingly, just like the Rapier, scales off intelligence as a secondary. But Musket has surely been another weapon that's been in the doghouse for quite a long time. Even worse than the Warhammer in my opinion. At least Warhammer was still considered pretty viable even after its nerfs, but Musket was always just left behind. Now I found during the preview that it can be a pretty good weapon during territory war defense, but there wasn't much usefulness past that point. Now however, since the recent buff across the board for this weapon, I think it might actually be making a comeback. On the left side, starting with the passives, we've got Critical Reload, Greater Accuracy, Ballistic Advantage, Hit Your Mark, Called Shot, Empowering Headshot, Called Shot Resupply, and Heightened Precision, with Sniper being the ultimate. For the skills, we've got ourselves Powder Burn, which overloads the musket with gunpowder, causing the next shot to deal 120% weapon damage and cause a burn status effect. The burn deals 20% weapon damage per second for 9 seconds, and it does not stack or combine with other overload shots. First passive is Backdraft, with the second being Chronic Trauma. Then we've got Power Shot, an old school favorite. Overload the musket with gunpowder, causing the next shot to deal 150% weapon damage. And the first passive is Initial Engagement, second passive is First Blood, and third, Bullseye. And then we have Shooter Stance. Players enter an aiming stance to enhance their performance. Shots deal 105% weapon damage, and while in the stance, rotation angle is limited to 180 degrees, mobility is reduced to 0, accuracy increased by 10%, and reload time reduced by 75%. This mode will also exit after 3 shots. First passive is Shoot More, with the second being Marksman. This side of the tree I would say does its job pretty well. With the addition of the skill known as Powder Burn, the musket has some debuff capabilities around it now. So while you're reloading, you still have that constant stream of DPS coming through, and since they buff multiple aspects of the weapon on the damage, you should be doing pretty good DPS in general. Now for the second tree, starting off with the passives, we've got Salt on the Wounds, Weaken Defense, Hustle, Energy Burst, Back It Up, Empowering Weakness, Tactical Reload, Kick them when they're down, and for the ultimate, Compound Adrenaline. Skill-wise, we've got ourselves Stopping Power, overload the musket with gunpowder, causing the next shot to deal 115% weapon damage, staggering the target and knocking them back 3 meters. 2 passives by the names of Lasting Impression and Supplementary Repulsion. Second skill, a core ability for any musket user, is Traps. Throw a trap that lasts for 20 seconds. When triggered, it causes the target to be rooted, immobilizing them for 3 seconds. First passive is known as Trap Damage, second passive, Scent of Blood, and third passive, Double Trap, with the last skill being Sticky Bomb. This one throws a bomb a short range that can stick to anything it makes contact with. Detonation will occur 5 seconds after impact, dealing 150% weapon damage to all targets within 3 meters. First passive is Unflinching Walk. Second passive, Sticky Slow. This tree is where you get more of your utility for musket. The traps can be very useful for keeping enemies locked down, and the sticky bombs, I used to like using them for territory wars to throw onto capture points for scrambling the enemy players with explosions. But that was when we had 2 charges instead of just 1. So now I'm not really sure if I would use it that much, but it does still remind me of Halo because it sticks to enemies, so it does get points for that. Weapon combo wise, just like the bow, I would probably have a melee weapon as a backup, like a spear or a rapier. One of the interesting things that I found combos really well with the musket now is what I briefly mentioned in the beginning, the Ice Gauntlet. See, case in point, whenever you throw a trap down, you can switch to the Gauntlet right after, pop down an Ice Storm and even a Pylon, and for the most part, the enemy is just going to have to eat it for a couple of seconds. And they can't stay in it, so that should create a little bit more distance between you. You've got the Entombed ability that you can of course use to regenerate mana, but blast enemies back away a few feet if they get close while you're shooting the musket. On top of that, a nifty little thing is that even if you switch back to the musket, the Ice Pylon you've summoned will not disappear. The Ice Storm will disappear as soon as you take off the Gauntlet, but I found the Ice Pylon thing to be pretty cool. Now with the ranged weapons out of the way, let's finish off with the magic. First up, the Fire Staff. Next to the Hatchet, this is the most powerful weapon in the game right now. I know it had its moments back in the day, like when Flamethrower would chunk your health like it was nothing, but no, it's back in the lead by a long shot. And in just a second, we'll talk about why. First thing is that the staff scales primarily and only off of intelligence. 2 skill trees by the name of Fire Mage and Pyromancer. On the left side, we've got the following passives: Spell Focus, Spell Slinger, Flare, Fiery Restoration, Clear Mind, Singe, Clear Casting, and Runes of Helios for the ultimate. For the spells, let's start with Pillar of Fire. All around, this can be a pretty decent skill to bring because of one of the passives that allows you to gain 10% of your maximum mana per enemy hit by Pillar of Fire. I think that's something that could be extremely useful in player versus environment. The spell deals a targeted amount of 120% weapon damage. The first passive is Fire Strike, and the second passive, Arson's Advantage. We have the famous Meteor Strike right after, a spell that drops 32 meteors at your target, dealing 20% weapon damage per hit, with the final and newly added spell, Fireball. fires off a heavy fireball that deals 200% weapon damage on impact and leaves a 3-meter burning field that lasts for 6 seconds. The burning field itself deals at least 10% weapon damage each second. Passives for this one is Scorched Earth and Catch. So this left side has some pretty useful spells. The Fire Staff is really good for AoE mob farming and would probably excel very much in invasions and in-game content. But even so, the most powerful spell in my opinion is actually located on the second tree known as Pyromancer. And speaking of that, it starts off with the Pyromania passive. Then we got Heat Up, Kindle, Trial by Fire, Let It Burn, Watch It Burn, and Combat Speed, with Reheat being the ultimate, which could be a very useful alternative to Pillar of Fire if you're spending the majority of your points on this side of the tree. Skill-wise, we've got Incinerate, which is the one that I would classify as being the most powerful Fire Staff ability. Causes a fiery explosion dealing 125% weapon damage and knocking back all enemies within 2 meters. Also catches enemies on fire dealing 3% weapon damage per second for 6 seconds. First passive is Scorched, second passive, Cauterize Wounds, and third passive, Flame Out. On the second one, we've got ourselves the Flamethrower. Create a jet of flame from the tip of your staff dealing 25% weapon damage per second. Each hit catches the enemy on fire dealing 3% weapon damage per second for 6 seconds. First passive is Fire's Reach, second passive, Internal Flames, third passive is Pyro Dancer, and lastly, we've got ourselves the Burnout. Dash forward, leaving a wall of fire behind you. Residual flames will catch all enemies on fire dealing 5% weapon damage per second for 13 seconds. Now this side of the tree I would say would be very useful for PvP. Even the Burnout skill has its usefulness ever since the Life Staff dash was removed from that weapon. But Incinerate is without a doubt the top ability in this entire roster of spells right now. Probably something that's required for the majority of Fire Staff builds right now, unless you're strictly going to be doing some long-range bombardments. Basic and heavy attack animations are relatively the same, except it was added recently that now we'll be able to move while casting these, and that's something that I'm incredibly glad they added. For weapon combinations, I would probably take this weapon with either a sword and shield or life staff, maybe the Gauntlet if I needed some extra AoE, but I think the Fire Staff does well enough on its own that any weapon in the second slot will always be a secondary. Now I said sword and shield because there is a mechanic, this is an old mechanic that still applies today. If you have an intelligence-based character, but you also have elemental gems inside of your weapon, like a fire element or void element on your sword, the damage of it will scale based off of your weapon damage or the intelligence, so battle mage builds are incredibly possible. Second to last weapon, and we've got ourselves the famous Life Staff, officially been made into a primarily support weapon and scales off the attribute known as Focus. The healing ability of it is still pretty powerful, but there were some big changes to how the weapon overall does function. It's actually pretty hard to solo farm with this weapon, so more than likely you'll need someone with you that can help you do damage and do content. I think the discussion around if that's a good thing or not is still being debated currently, but one thing I would love to see come back, even in a much weaker state, is if they added Siphon onto one of the passives, where you could either hold down right click, or they can make it into a heavy attack so that you can both heal your teammates, or life drain enemies while moving around. But alright, as we know, the Life Staff scales off Focus, 2 skill trees by the name of Healing and Protector. First skill tree's passive starts with Desperate Speed, Sacred Protection, Absolved, Mending Touch, Blissful Touch, Revitalize, Arcane Justice, Intensity, with Divine Blessing being the ultimate. Skill-wise, we've got Divine Embrace, heal target for 150% weapon damage, first passive is Privilege, second passive, Shared Struggle, and third passive, Rebound. Then we have ourselves the Sacred Ground. Create an area on the ground that lasts for 12 seconds and heals 10% weapon damage per second. Passives are Holy Ground and Blessed. And lastly, we have Splash of Light. You and all party members are healed for 50% weapon damage. First passive is Shared Recovery, and second is Purify. So this weapon I haven't had a whole lot of experience with yet since the new changes, but right now the Splash of Light spell seems to be one of the most useful to have, alongside the Beacon one in the second tree. But with this Splash of Light giving a group-wide heal that is also able to remove debuffs, I can see it being a really powerful tool for keeping people alive, especially because you don't even have to aim it. And for the second tree, the passives start off with Bend Light, then Protector's Strength, Spirits United, Defensive Light, Protector's Touch, Balance, and Glowing Focus, with Magnify being the ultimate. On the skill side, we've got Orb of Protection, shoots out a light projectile that grants 15% Fortify for 12 seconds, heals an ally for 10% of the weapon damage, and deals 95% weapon damage when it hits an enemy. For the passives, we've got Protector's Blessing, Shared Protection, and Aegis. Second skill is Light's Embrace. Targeted heal for 75% of the weapon damage, plus 30% more for each buff on the target. First passive is Inspire, second passive is Connection, and the third, of course, is Magnify. And lastly, we've got Beacon. Shoots out a light projectile that deals 95% weapon damage to enemies, attaches to a target, and heals all nearby allies for 20% weapon damage per second for 10 seconds. First passive is Infuse Light, second is Radiance Blessing, and third is Speed of Light. So with all these vast changes that we talked about before, Lifestaff has become primarily a support weapon, but it's the only one of its kind at the moment that scales off focus, so it's a little rough trying to level the weapon up on its own. You'll absolutely need a party or a backup weapon. It is worth it for those of you interested in support, but I will cross my fingers for another focus weapon in the future. Basic and heavy attacks are still the same, just like the Fire Staff you are able to move while casting. Weapon combinations, I would more than likely take just about anything, because with this, you'll more than likely be trying to support most of the time, so it might not even matter what your backup weapon is. But I guess the one that would make the most sense at the moment would be the Fire Staff. And last but not least, I know we've been through a lot, but we've got ourselves the newly introduced Polar Ice Cap Generating, putting Sub-Zero to shame, but actually not quite yet. The freaking Ice Gauntlet. Scales primarily off of intelligence with 2 skill trees by the name of Ice Tempest and Builder. Passives on the left side start with Cold Reach, then Energize Critical, Heavy Freeze, Critical Rejuvenation, Gathering Storm, and Critical Frost, with Ultimate Chill being the ultimate. Skills are going to consist of Wind Chill, an attack that does a focus beam of freezing wind that'll push back any enemies in the area and causing damage. Wind Chill will last for about 2 seconds, have a range of 5 meters, and can be directed by the facing of the player, and you are able to move while casting the spell. First passive is Enduring Chill, second passive is Shatter, and then for the second skill, we've got Ice Spikes. Creates a trail of spikes that starts from the player and goes out in a straight line for 8 meters. The path ends with a mighty spike that'll cause large damage and pushback. Pressing left mouse button before reaching the end will spawn the mighty spike early. First passive, Refreshing Spikes, second passive, Empowered Strikes, third is Deadly Path, and fourth, Spiky Reach. Then for the third skill, we got Ice Storm, one of my personal favorites so far. A ranged attack that damages and slows enemies within a 5 meter frosted area. 25% slow, 20 meter range, and 5-second duration. I feel like this side does sound good on paper, but the most useful skill that I've seen from the bunch is the Ice Storm. The spikes sound pretty cool and look nice, but the usefulness of them kind of pales in comparison to the Storm, and 2 of the other spells in the next tree. For the Builder, passives start off with Blocking Stamina, Frozen Touch, Defiant Freeze, Quick Frost, Empowered Frost, and Refreshing Frost, with Ultimate Frost being the ultimate. Skill-wise, we've got Ice Shower, summons a shower of ice that creates a frosted area approximately 1 meter by 5 meters. Enemies that enter the shower will be stricken with the powerful Frostbite. This blocks sprinting and dodging, slows speed by 50%, and will remain on the target for 1 second after exiting Ice Shower. An Ice Shower has a lifetime of 4 seconds. First passive is Enduring Shower, second passive, Quick Shower, and third, Shower Slush. Second spell is Ice Pylon, which I think will be a pretty popular choice for just about any build that has the Gauntlet. This places a pylon that fires ice projectiles at enemies within a 20 meter radius for 15 seconds or until killed. Ice Pylon also creates a 1 meter radius frosted area that enables frost powers. Important to notate again that after you summon this, even if you switch weapons, the pylon will still stay active so you can continue your combos. First passive is Greater Pylon, then Pylon Regen, Pylon Dodge, Pylon Refresh, and of course, the ultimate. And lastly, the last skill of the day, Entombed. Players can entomb themselves in ice to become invulnerable and greatly increase the mana regeneration. The Ice Tomb has a lifetime of 10 seconds and can be destroyed. But if you either exit by hitting right mouse button or left mouse button, you can choose between simply canceling it or breaking out and pushing all enemies away. Passives are Strengthen Tomb and Cleansing Tomb. So for the Gauntlet, this is what the basic and heavy attack animations really look like. For weapon combinations, I would more than likely try to use a Fire Staff, or with the Sword and Shield do a Battle Mage build with intelligence stacking like we talked about with the Fire Staff. Or even that weird combo I told you about where you could use a Musket and this one at the same time. For the weapon overall, I don't think it has enough power to be considered a true primary on its own like the Fire Staff, but some skills within it are pretty nice. I think it's just a case where some of these weapons need to get to the state of the Rapier, where almost every skill can be viable or useful in some way. But that'll do it for the entirety of the 2021 Ultimate Weapons Guide. I really appreciate you clicking on this video. It took a lot of work to put out. Make sure to leave a like and a comment below about what weapon is your most anticipated to use, or which skills and passives you would take instead, or weapon combinations. Leave it all below. Have a wonderful night or day, folks, and farewell.